Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Coordinator at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Congress narrowly avoided a government shutdown on October 1st, successfully passing a 45-day funding bill to keep the government open. With another shutdown fight set for next month, today's episode will feature audio from a previous podcast episode covering the budget and appropriations process and why it matters for immigration policy. And if you're wondering what a shutdown means for DHS and the border, check out our previous episode where podcast regular Theresa Cardinal Brown walks listeners through what they can expect. Stay tuned. Theresa and Laura, welcome back to This Week in Immigration.
Glad to be here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you both for joining. So let's get right into the issue. On March 9th, President Biden released a so-called skinny budget with the outlines of what the administration would be asking Congress to provide the government for the 2024 fiscal year, which begins on October 1st of this year. A week later, the administration released the details of this budget in thousands of pages from every department and agency in the federal government. This process kicks off the annual appropriations season in Washington. So let's start with a discussion of that process. Laura, we've talked about the annual budget and appropriations process on this podcast before, but can you just refresh our memories with a high-level overview of how this is supposed to work?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I think the key phrase you said there is how this is supposed to work, which is very different from how it actually ends up working. But how it is supposed to work is the president releases a budget. Congress then passes a budget resolution, which is kind of the high level number where all the spending in the federal government should take place. The high level number is divided into categories, like appropriations bills is what they're called. There is one for the Department of State, which kind of funds all of our activities that we do internationally. There is one for the Department of Defense, which funds the military and kind of all those services. The appropriations bills, in theory, should be voted on individually by the House, by the Senate, and then signed by the president. And so all those individual appropriations bills kind of wrap up into the big budget number. Now, in reality, that doesn't always happen. That what the Congress has kind of been doing over the past couple of years, packaging some of these bills together in little minibus appropriations bills where they kind of consider a few of them together. They have something called an omnibus where they package all of them together and vote on it there. It's kind of too early in the process to know if they're going to take one of those kind of procedural tricks. But my money is on the fact that they will, because that's kind of how it's been operating over the past couple of years. So in theory, they should be passing these appropriations bills one by one. In reality, they'll probably wait till right up until the deadline and package a few of them together and vote on them as a group.
Theresa, let's talk about the immigration component of the process here. Is there a budget for immigration for the United States? And if so, who's in charge of it?
Well, that's a very good question. No, there isn't a single budget for immigration for the United States. As Laura mentioned, the way the budget works and the appropriations process in Congress works is it's usually broken down by department or agency of the federal government. So there is a budget for all of the Department of Homeland Security, some of which is related to immigration and some of which is not. There are immigration pieces of the Department of Justice's budget, of the State Department's budget, of the Labor Department's budget. So immigration spending for all of the federal government is kind of spread out across several departments. And that means in Congress, it's spread out among different appropriations committees because there's a subcommittee for each of these 13 appropriations bills that Laura mentioned. Only a few of them cover more than one department or agency. So the State Department has its own bill that covers the State Department and all foreign operations. The Justice Department is packaged with the Commerce Department and science activities of the federal government in one bill. Department of Homeland Security has its own bill. The Labor Department and Health and Human Services are packaged together in a bill. So if you wanted to find out how much the United States government spent on everything we do related to immigration, you would have to look across probably at least four, maybe five different bills to figure all that out. So if you ask me who's in charge of the immigration budget, there's no single person or committee that's in charge of all of the immigration funding for the federal government, and that's I think an issue in why sometimes it feels like the parts of the immigration system don't work well together.
I mean, yeah, it sounds very confusing, and I'm curious, how do all of these various interests coordinate, or do they?
So, in the executive branch, under the president, there is an organization called the Office of Management and Budget, whose job it is to look across all of the federal government and all of these departments and agencies and try to make sure that all of the budgets meet the president's overall priorities. So, the way the process works within the agencies is the agency on its own kind of produces its desired budget. This is what I'd love to get to do these things. They send it to the Office of Management and Budget, who sends them back a bunch of questions and says, well, you're asking probably for too much than I think we could ask Congress for. So you need to cut over here, or this is a president's priority. Why didn't you ask for enough money there? Things like that. So after that pass back process happens, then the OMB looks across all of the federal departments and agencies and says, they kind of do that. Are we spending enough on immigration? Now, whether or not they actually do that in a cohesive way is subject to some probably questions. But then flipping over to Congress, nope, doesn't happen like that at all. Unless there's more than one of these things that fall under one of those appropriations bills, the subcommittees pretty much run their own show when it comes to their appropriations bill. Now, they all report to one appropriations committee in the House and one in the Senate. At that point, members could look across at everything, but as Laura said, it's rare that all of these 13 bills get considered on their own. So then it all gets wrapped up into these bigger bills. And then usually the debate is about the top line for everything and certain priorities that the parties want to see in the bills, not necessarily looking across the entire immigration system.
So, Laura, let's get back to you. The House is now controlled by Republicans, and they just received a budget from the president of the other party. So, what do they do now? Do they look at this budget? Do they just ignore it and do their own thing? What can we expect to see?
The second one. The budgets are kind of an outline of your party's priorities, right? Where you spend your money kind of shows what you value. I think that there's probably a little bit of distance between what President Biden would like to see enacted, kind of where he thinks the federal government should be spending their money and allocating their resources, and where the House Republican caucus will kind of show their priorities. So they will put out their own budget. It's probably going to be a little bit of a messaging piece. I don't know if it'll get very granular in terms of specifics. I think what we've seen in the past is they'll kind of highlight and outline places where they think the United States should be spending their money based on kind of where their priorities lie as a party and a caucus. So I think we will see a budget from the Republicans, but again, I'm not sure that will actually be where we end up spending our money at the end of the day. It's more a little bit of a place to kind of showcase where they think the country should be headed.
Well, with the new fiscal year starting in a little over 6 months, it seems like there's a lot of work to do to fund the government, let alone pass other legislation. So, in that context, Laura, where does the appropriations process stack in the list of priorities that Congress has every year?
It's a pretty big one, right? They need to fund the federal government. I think if they were to kind of work through things in a traditional manner, as we've just kind of been going over, going through the subcommittee process, then going to a committee process, then going to a floor vote, and doing this kind of bill by bill, it's a lot of work. I think that that's why they've been kind of packaged in the past, because it's easier to kind of roll a few things together and do this 2 or 3 times versus 13 times. So I think that we will probably, but it has to happen, right? If they don't pass a budget, we kind of get a government shutdown, and that's not something that anyone wants. So it's a pretty high priority. There's also plenty of other things that I know they want to focus on. No one gets elected and comes to Congress to like just pass a budget, right? They want to do big sweeping things. They want to pass pieces of legislation that matter to them and their constituents. So it's not always the most exciting thing to do the appropriations process in past budgets, but it's a necessary thing. So it's pretty high up there. And I'll also say there are ways to kind of work some of their priorities into the appropriations process. We know that these are these must pass bills that they have to have every year in order to keep the government funded. So they can kind of get to some of their policy goals through the appropriations process by adding things onto the bills and funding things that they feel are important to them and their constituents.
I'm curious if the debt limit plays any role in the appropriations process. We've been hearing a lot about the debt limit. We here at BPC project the X date. So, for our listeners, if you're interested, please check out our debt limit tracker on our website. And we know that Republicans want to use a vote to raise the debt ceiling to get cuts in other spending. So, what role, if any, does this play in the appropriations process?
I think it does play a role. Well, there's a few different views out there, but BBC's view is obviously that we need to have a vote to raise the debt ceiling, that's an important to kind of our solvency as a country. And so you've got that on one hand, balanced with the fact that we need to pass budgets and appropriations bills to fund everything that the government prioritizes. So these are two kind of must pass pieces of legislation, at least according to BPC, and a good majority of folks out there. So it remains to be seen how this is going to play out. Do they package them together, these two must pass things? Do they take them one by one? I think it's kind of an issue that Kevin McCarthy, as the Republican leader of the House, is going to have to kind of work out amongst his members. And it's a little bit of a dance. How you package them? How do you package them? How do you sequence them? I think we've got the summer to figure it out, but it'll be here before we know it.
Theresa, given all of this work that has to get done and the challenges that we've just laid out, why does the president's budget for immigration matter? Like, why should we pay attention to it? Why do we care?
Well, I think, you have to understand the president's budget, is a policy document and a monetary document, right? So it basically says this is the priority for this president of where they want to spend the government's money to do these things, right? So they put money toward the things that they want to do. And they indicate, particularly when they look at changes from the last year's budget. So we're asking for an increase over here. There's a new program that we want to put in place over here, and we're asking for money for that. So if you look at the budget as a policy document, and I really think we should, you can get a very good sense of what the administration's policy priorities are, the policies they intend or hope they will be able to put in place in the next year, and the money they are allocating to do it. So that's why I think it's important that you look at the budget. And not just for immigration, by the way, for any policy area that we're talking about. Obviously, the president's budget is not binding on Congress, it's his wish list. And as we have already heard, Congress passes its own budget and says, okay, well, here's our priorities as a Congress. And then at the end of the day, since the president has to sign these appropriations bills, what you're hoping is that Congress's priorities and the president's priorities will at some point line up, or they will pass what they can where both sides agree. And that's the process that matters.
Well, when it comes to Congress's appropriations work, is it just about funding for immigration, or are there other ways in which that process impacts how our immigration system functions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, in addition to the fact that the bills that are passed and enacted actually give the government the money that it's supposed to spend over the next year, there's a couple of ways in which Congress can kind of indicate things that it wants the administration to do, besides just where it puts the money. One is the so-called Appropriations Committee reports. So every bill that passes out of Congress has a report from the committee that authorized that bill that kind of explains the reasoning for the bill. With appropriations bills, though, the reports are really kind of directions to the government, because the appropriations bill itself is kind of bland. It says, Congress authorizes X amount of dollars for this thing, and that's all it really says. But in the report, it says, what we really want you to do with this money is this. And last year you asked us for this amount, and you didn't tell us really very well this year what you spent that on. So we're going to direct you to give us another report. So a lot of congressional reports come about in these committee languages, not necessarily in the appropriations statute itself. The other way this process matters for policy is, as Laura said, sometimes these bills have other things that are attached to them. We call them riders. A rider is what would normally or might be in its own piece of legislation, but because Congress doesn't have enough time to get to everything, it's attached as an amendment to this big spending bill, and it can get enacted that way. So a lot of pretty big pieces of law actually came about as riders on an appropriations bill. So it's worth kind of keeping an eye out for what those kind of additional things might be. It might be something small, like in many years, Congress has authorized the Department of Homeland Security to add more visas to the H-2B temporary worker program each year after the cap is reached. And they've done that via authorizing language on the appropriations bill. So there can be important things that are done on this appropriations process that aren't just about the money and where the money's spent. And so it's worth, at the end of the day, looking for what did Congress actually enact when it passed those bills.
Thank you, Theresa. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll look at some of the specifics of President Biden's budget request for immigration. Okay, and we're back. So, we've been talking generally about the budget and appropriations process, but let's dive in a bit more to what's in the president's budget for immigration. Theresa, when you peruse the thousands of pages of details on his budget, what were some of the highlights on immigration that stuck out to you?
So there were several, one of which is that if you look at the overall budget for the Department of Homeland Security, it looks like they're asking to cut the budget of the Department of Homeland Security. If you just look at the total top line that they're asking for versus what was enacted last year, there's a 0.5 percentage point decrease in the overall budget. But that's a little misleading because one of the biggest things they're asking for is a new border contingency fund of $4.7 billion. So what they're asking to do is create a fund that is outside the normal appropriations, but from which they can draw when apprehensions or encounters at the southwest border reach sort of certain triggering points. If it doesn't, then money just goes into this fund to have available for later use. Now, in theory, we think, BPC thinks this is not a bad idea. We have recommended over the past few years that we create something like an immigration FEMA where we have ability to surge resources and capacity to the border when we have mass migration events. So in theory, the idea that we can't predict, for example, what our encounters at the border are going to look like from year to year. And so trying to estimate that based on a budget, especially over the last 10 years when we've seen such great changes in what's happening at the US-Mexico border from year to year, it kind of makes sense that you would want something that's not subject to that annual cap. Because if you don't do that and you need more resources, then Congress has to pass something called a supplemental appropriations bill in the middle of fiscal year, which is, please give us more money. In this way, with a contingency fund, the money's already there and they can draw on it when they need to, and then Congress can replenish it in a future appropriation cycle. That's similar to how we fund some of the disaster response funding, for example. However, I would say that the way the administration has proposed this fund, it's pretty clear they're going to use it this year. So it's unclear why they wouldn't just ask for this as part of their base budget and then ask about a contingency fund for the future. But, I think this is one of those debates that will have to go back and forth between the administration and Congress. A couple of other things that are worth note. The Department of Health and Human Services is part of the immigration system in that their Office of Refugee Resettlement is responsible for the entire resettlement program of the United States. When refugees are approved overseas and then brought to the United States, the government helps fund them for the first few months while they get set up, and HHS is responsible for that funding. They're seeing one of the largest increases among all of the cabinet departments from last year's level, including a 14% increase for this Office of Refugee Resettlement. And one of the reasons is they really want to try to get to the president's target of 125,000 refugees for the year. They are woefully beneath that right now. And part of it is because the refugee resettlement system has not been funded very well in the last few years. They also are dealing with a very large number of unaccompanied children who arrive at the border. That's also the responsibility of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And one of the things I think that ORR will probably look to do, although this wasn't in the president's budget, given the recent cases that we've seen in the news of children who are released from ORR custody sponsors found working in really not great conditions in places in the country. So that will probably be another place where the president and Congress will discuss whether there needs to be additional money to oversee what happens to these children when they're released from ORR custody. The Justice Department, which oversees our immigration courts, is also asking for a 66% increase in its immigration court system to address record-breaking backlogs, 1.8 million cases they have. And in the last year, they saw almost twice as many new cases put into the court as they were able to finish. So they really need help to be able to dig out of the backlog and just process the many, many new cases that are coming in. Another interesting feature is they have asked for $150 million to create a grant program to help provide legal representation to immigrants who need it in the immigration court system. So immigrants can be represented by lawyers in court if they are able to find their own lawyers. Oftentimes, this is nonprofit organizations or pro bono help from attorneys, but this would be the first time that the government itself would try to help fund additional resources, because one of the things we hear a lot from the immigration bar is that there simply aren't enough attorneys for all the cases that are out there right now. And so this might help build capacity. Lastly, as I mentioned, this contingency fund for the border would fund both CBP, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and FEMA when needed to address additional arrivals at the southwest border. And I'm sorry, one more thing. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency that processes benefit applications and petitions for immigrants and non-immigrants, is also asking once again for $865 million to help it address its case backlog, which is growing to almost 3 million cases. They asked for and received that money 2 years ago. They asked for it last year, did not receive it. So they're once again asking for this. And that's a pretty big deal because they are woefully, woefully underwater with a lot of their case processing. Employment authorization documents are taking longer, extensions or change of status are taking longer, immigrant visa petitions are taking longer. And they're supposed to be a completely fee-funded agency, but fee receipts during COVID went down dramatically. And then they saw a very big spike in the kinds of cases that they don't usually charge for: asylum and refugee processing. So they're in some financial straits trying to dig out of that hole as well. So those are the highlights. There's a lot more to dig into in the details, but those are some of the big things that I saw.
As you just mentioned, we've got all these different departments, agencies making different budget requests to fulfill their varying needs. And we've already heard how Congress doesn't look at the whole immigration budget together. But let me ask, does the administration do that? Do all of the various agencies and departments talk to each other when putting together their budgets to see how it would impact the others? Or do they generally rely on the OMB to do that kind of coordination for them?
So yes and no. So each agency prepares its own department, and each department prepares its own budget on its own. Part of the OMB process is to share that budget with the other cabinet departments. And so other cabinets do have a chance to sort of weigh in on other cabinets' budgets. The extent to which they do that really depends on the capacity they have of people to actually go through and look at somebody else's budget in the time frame they have to get the budget documents done. So there is a process that would allow this to happen, but I would say it's pretty diffuse, and it's not necessarily going to catch everything. But there have been cases in the past where another cabinet department will vociferously object to something that somebody else is doing. And then OMB has to kind of mediate between the cabinet departments and say, okay, if that we can't work this out, then the president will decide, or we'll decide just we're going with this department over this department. So sometimes those things do happen, but usually it's more a matter of making sure that people are at least notified of what other departments are doing. The level of coordination for the budget, I think, is probably not as good as it could be, and I think some of that's they have to do it every year. Right, the president just submitted his FY 2024 budget, and every agency is going to go up to Congress and try to defend that budget and try to get Congress to give them the money they asked for. At the same time, back at their own department, they're starting to work on next year's budget and actually preparing the initial part of the year after that. So the agencies are kind of working on three budgets. They have to spend last year's budget, they have to defend this year's budget, and plan next year's budget all at the same time. That's a lot to do. And so I do think it means that the kind of coordination that we would hope would happen may not happen just because people have too much on their plate.
Well, one of the things you mentioned that this budget requests is a contingency fund, which aligns with something BPC has advocated for, which is an immigration FEMA. You've written about this in an op-ed for The Hill. But outside of that, in your opinion, where does this budget go right and where does it go wrong in terms of its funding priorities for immigration?
Well, a couple of things that I noted. As I mentioned, there wasn't specific funding for ORR, for example, to look after the unaccompanied youth that it releases from its custody. I think that's something that's definitely going to come back, especially since we now have a couple of times where children that have been released from custody have been found out to be in what are not good conditions. So I think that's something that is likely to come out of Congress this year. As I mentioned, I think the contingency fund is a good idea, but frankly, they need that money now, and it's not really a contingency. We really do need to have a lot more funding for what's happening at the border right now. And until Congress can agree on changes to the law and how it's enforced at the border, they're going to need more people. They're going to need more places. They're going to need more resources to be able to process the people who are arriving. And I think that it will probably precipitate some of that policy discussion about what needs to happen at the border. But I think that's another thing that's definitely going to be part of the conversation. Look, I absolutely agree that USCIS needs funding for backlog reduction. They have asked that at least a part of USCIS, the refugee part, be fully funded by appropriations and not fee funded. But honestly, I think we need to revisit the entire USCIS fee funding structure, or at least think about how we balance it out from year to year. Interestingly enough, the part of Department of Justice that runs the immigration courts actually asked for that. They asked for 2-year budget authority. In other words, they're saying we can't really know how many new cases are coming in. We can't plan because it takes so long to hire new people and build the facilities for them to work at. We can't get it all spent in a year. Can we get 2-year budget authority so we can plan out that long to be able to really do things? I think that's a thing that, frankly, the whole government should be thinking about, because Congress can't seem to pass all of its appropriations in one year. And it's really hard for governments who don't get their money oftentimes for the current fiscal year until partway through the fiscal year to spend it all in the way Congress wants. So we're not really doing this in an efficient way. So I think that's something else that can be looked at. Lastly, I know there's going to be a fight, there is every year, about the number of detention beds that ICE has. The president has asked for a decrease to 25,000, although this contingency fund would allow them to bulk up to the 35,000, which has been normal. But we've heard in the news recently that they want to reopen family detention. That's a very expensive proposition. They also need a lot more money for Immigration and Customs Enforcement just to track all the people that have been released from the border so far, and to run some of these other programs that they're looking to run. So I think they got some things right. I think there's other things they probably need to think about a little longer and a little more. But, at the end of the day, it's really what Congress is willing to do that matters.
Laura, you've already spoken about House Republicans' response to the budget. We know we can expect them to put out their own. But how do you think they'll respond to some of these immigration requests?
I think the response will be mixed, but leaning towards a little bit, probably not too favorable about some of them. I think we just know that this is an issue where the two parties are coming from very different places on. When the Republicans took control of the House, they made it pretty clear that their top priority in the immigration space was going to be the southern border. And I think that that's still where their kind of posture is. I think they view kind of this issue very much strongly through that border security lens. I think some of these other priorities are probably a little further down their list. But at the same time, they're not a monolithic group, right? There's a lot of different priorities within the party. At the end of the day, there might be some folks willing to kind of work with Democrats on some of these issues. I think that there could be some places on, some of the work visas and things like that where we can find compromise. I think that the border security, though, is at least in a high level piece still kind of going to be where as a party they kind of tend to put their focus.
So you mentioned that there may be some room for compromise here. Can Republicans and Democrats come together to somehow pass something that the president would sign? Is that something we could expect?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it kind of, back to what we've been talking about before, this will probably not be a piece of legislation that's just immigration focused alone. So I am pretty confident that Republicans and Democrats will come together on a big spending bill that the president signs. Is it going to have a lot of immigration pieces in it? Maybe. But I think that at the end of the day, when you kind of cobble together a bunch of these different issues, there's something in it for everyone. So the bill will probably get signed at the end of the day. Will it be the place where we kind of make a lot of progress on immigration issues? I think it's probably too early to tell, but I do think there'll be a bill at the end of the day.
Teresa, where do you think there might be room for bipartisan agreement here?
I think, as Laura said, some of the funding for example, Office of Refugee Resettlement and taking care of the kids, I do think that that's something that Congress can probably come to agreement on. No one wants to see kids put in vulnerable situations. I think, the border discussion, DHS is asking for a lot of resources, and there are some people that would be happy to give money to DHS to secure the border, but not necessarily for the things that DHS would spend it on. So I think that's going to be that they might get a lot of money, but they may not get it for the things that they've asked for. I think the funding for USCIS might be a little more controversial. Not that I think people don't want to see USCIS be able to deal with the backlogs, but I think they're going to ask a lot of hard questions about how efficient the government is. Are they wasting money? There's all these new parole programs that the president has authorized that don't have fees attached. Is the USCIS in trouble because basically the president has created a bunch of new programs without funding? And that's not, why should we backfill that, right? So I think that's part of the conversation that's going to happen. At the end of the day, I agree with Laura. This will be a large package. Even the Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill has not been enacted on its own, I think, since the early years of the department. It's been a very long time. It almost always gets rolled into a bigger bill because it tends to be one of the most controversial bills because of all the border and immigration stuff. And so, given that bill usually has to have a lot of other sweeteners for people if they don't like what the final DHS budget looks like. They have other things in there that they like, and I think that's where the trade-offs will probably happen, and we'll just have to see how it all works out in the end of the day.
BPC has long advocated for fiscal restraint and clear eyed looking at our budgets and deficit reduction. With the seminal report in 2010 from a task force led by former Senator Pete Domenici and former OMB director and founding director of the Congressional Budget Office, Alice Rivlin. So I have to ask, where does the president's budget priorities for immigration stand in relation to tackling our deficits?
Well, this is a really big question. And, we talked earlier about sort of the debt limit vote. And you have to understand that the debt limit is basically authorizing an increase in the federal government's credit card to cover the spending that Congress has already told the government to do, right? So Congress has already said, you will spend this money. and you will spend it on these things. And if that money is more than the amount the government is taking in, then it has to borrow to spend that. Because if it doesn't spend the money Congress has authorized, then it's in default and it is violating the law and Congress gets mad at it. So, part of this, and I think that's why BPC says you have to increase the debt limit. It's spending you've already authorized. But they do want to see, like, we should be looking at the future, not always authorizing more spending than we have money coming in, which has been the pattern of the government for much of the last few years. So I think that, just looking at the immigration spending, there's a lot of big increases there. There's a lot of big numbers. There's also a lot of big need. One of the advantages of this contingency fund, for example, is that we try to set aside money now so that we don't have to borrow money later when we have need of it because there's a migration emergency. So in concept, that kind of funding is good because it means we're less likely to have to borrow money in the future when we have another emergency to deal with when it comes to migration. But again, if we need that money now to deal with what's happening now, then we kind of have to spend that money now. So I think that overall, the president is proposing a budget that's a big budget. It's a big increase. He's proposing to pay for that with a lot of tax increases on other things. And I think that's another place where Republicans in particular will probably disagree with the president about where he's taxing and how he's taxing to pay for things. In general, they'd rather see spending reduced than taxes increased. But it's also true that the vast majority of our federal budget is not this. It's not all of our immigration stuff in the federal budget is a tiny fraction of the overall money we spend, most of which is spent on Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, and defense. Those are the very big buckets. And those are things that people don't want to touch. So if those are things that we can't reduce spending from, then we're trying to balance the budget on a much smaller portion, and immigration is the tiniest fraction of that. So even though there will be debate over how much we need to spend and where, at the end of the day, the immigration budget isn't breaking the federal government's bank. That having been said, being able to manage immigration well can have fiscal benefits. And we did 2 reports looking at the fiscal benefits of increasing immigration in the future. And immigrants mostly pay more into the federal coffers than they take out. And that's been the National Academies of Science study had the same thing, and so did our studies. So, if we can get our immigration system working and can think about expanding legal immigration, that has the ability to help our bottom line in the future.
Laura, Theresa, thank you both so much for joining us today and breaking down the budget and appropriations process for immigration.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. Send your comments and feedback to us at immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hannah Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Jordan, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Jack Malday, and Justice Antonoli. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.